Welcome. This is Ruth McCambridge, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Nonprofit Quarterly. As many of you already know, the Nonprofit Quarterly publishes a journal for nonprofit leaders, which covers management and governance issues, and it also publishes a daily newswire, which helps you to make sense of your operating environment so that you can better negotiate it. But today we are very, very happy to welcome you to our webinar on the sustainability mindset. And we're particularly happy to host this webinar because we know this tool extremely well, the process that will be described to you today. And in our mind, it's one of the most elegant and practical processes an organization can use to basically chart its way forward. To present on it, we have Jeanne Bell of Compass Point and Steve Zimmerman, and they are the authors of the new version of the sustainability mindset, and they will present on basically what the basic concept is, what updates have been done to it, what their experience have been in using it, and then they'll take questions from you. So without further ado, because we have a lot to do on this webinar, I'm going to hand this over to Steve Zimmerman to just bring us up to date and give us a quick refresher on the original concepts of the matrix map and the sustainability concept.
Thank you, Ruth. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. It's hard to believe that it has been 4 years since the original book that Jeanne and I wrote together with Jan Masaoka came out in Nonprofit Sustainability, where we really looked at what does it take for nonprofit organizations to be able to thrive and to deliver exceptional impact in a financially viable manner. And when we talk about sustainability, and oftentimes talking with people about the elements of sustainability come up, what does it take to be sustainable? And some of the things that people will say to us are, impact, understanding what your impact is, revenue streams and having consistent and perhaps some autonomous revenue streams, having the right people on the bus, being able to bring all these things together and being responsive to your market. And what it makes us realize is that whereas sometimes when you think about sustainability, people go immediately to the financial aspects, for a nonprofit organization to be sustainable is actually a pretty broad it's a pretty broad definition, and it takes a lot of different factors. So we define sustainability as encompassing more than just finances. It actually is at the intersection, both at the same time, of both financial sustainability, that ability to generate resources today without jeopardizing the future, and programmatic sustainability. There's a deep interconnectedness between these two that are really important. If you don't have a financial structure and a revenue strategy, then your best program plans are just dreams. And likewise, we build the organizations actually for impact as opposed to just financial strength. So it is about having both of these conversations at the same time and recognizing that these are the same conversation. Financial sustainability and programmatic sustainability together are one and of the same in what makes a nonprofit sustainable. So we started with kind of a broad definition of sustainability, and this represents the dual bottom line for nonprofits, where we took a look at how everything an organization does interacts to create both that programmatic and financial sustainability. Every single activity, both the mission-specific programs as well as fund development programs. And took a look and plotted it on this diagram here that we called the matrix map, which then shows the interaction between how is it that the activities that an organization carries out reinforce each other so that an organization can be sustainable. And one of the things that we note from looking at this picture is that when we think about it, these things change all the time. And so this may be a snapshot at a point in time for an organization, but organizations are dynamic. Our markets are changing, how we, our constituents' needs are changing. So therefore, our activities and their ability to deliver on impact and profitability change all the time, which led us to another thing about sustainability, that we said that sustainability is an orientation. It's not a destination. Oftentimes when we talk about sustainability or when we hear people talk about it, people will say, we want a sustainable business model. Well, who doesn't? But we talk about it as if it's a destination, a place that we can go and we can arrive, and then you can sit and put your feet up and money will just keep flowing in. The reality is that doesn't change because of the dynamics and the context in which we operate, because of the needs of our constituents, because of competition, because of funder interest, because of all those bigger issues that are influencing our organization and our ability to be sustainable. So it's an ongoing frame. It's an orientation, and it's a way of thinking. And that, as we say here, it's not something done once and then you're done. It's not something that's done like a strategic plan on every 3 or 5 year cycle. It is something that is done on an ongoing basis. And that those organizations that are truly sustainable have explained and have shared understanding of what the impact and financial drivers are throughout the organization. It's not held by one person, it's held throughout the organization. It really, as we say here, is a mindset and a way of organizational being. So if it's an ongoing, first we say that sustainability is broad, and then we say that it's an ongoing thing, it begins to become fairly difficult. So the question is, how do we make that a little bit easier? And the tool that we introduced with the first book, the Matrix Map, is a way of doing that, of understanding your organization's business model. And it's a picture there, as you can see, kind of on the right, a visual depiction of how everything an organization does affects its ability to deliver impact in a financially viable way. So it shows you what we do. Those are what the bubbles are. The color differentiation, and this one between the blue and the green, represent those programs which are what we call mission specific, those kind of programs who are primarily tasked with carrying out our mission, and those programs which are fund development programs. We put them all on the map. The size of the bubble lets us know what we're investing. It represents the gross expenses for each program there, so you can see kind of which ones are we investing our most resources in. And then its placement on the map, left or right, represents its financial results. So those on the right there are generating a surplus, and those on the left there are not yet at break even, and may not ever be. And then we have the relative mission impact, which is depicted by the placement up or down there on the vertical axis. So all of these together, again, show you how each program in its own way is contributing overall to the organization's impact and financial health.
That's great. Thank you so much, Steve. And so, Jeanne, you've been working with this Matrix Map with a lot of different kinds of nonprofits over the years. So I wonder if you could tell us what it is that you've learned in doing that work.
Thank you. Yeah, and thanks for getting us grounded, Steve. So Steve and I spent, obviously, a couple weekends writing the follow-on book, and we started really parsing through what we had been learning as we were consulting. When Jeanne and Steve and I wrote the first book, it was more of a conceptual framework inspired by what we were realizing wasn't working about the traditional strategic planning that we were doing, but it was more conceptual than experience-based. And so we really didn't have hundreds and hundreds of examples that we'd all been through of using the Matrix Map. Well, now we do, and so as we sat down to write the follow-on book, we wanted to sort of parse out what are we really learning about why this tool works, what context it works in, et cetera. So I just want to share a couple of those kind of lessons or themes from our work, and this is from both Steve and me. The first thing is that, indeed, one of the things that the matrix map process, I mean, what Steve just showed you was the result of the matrix map process is a matrix map. But as we learned in consulting with groups around this, or training, or other kinds of clinic formats, is that, of course, it's the process of getting clear on all this stuff. What is impact? What is excellent execution? What is profitability? What even are our program lines? And how do we even think about them as distinct from one another, and having a relative contribution on those two axes? So one of the things that we confirmed in working with groups is that most nonprofit folks are just going, and they're being as strategic as they can, but one of the challenges they face is finding a space to have rigorous conversations about what their experience of delivering these programs actually is. And that can be dicey. And so one of the things we do with groups is really help them create a space, multiple spaces over a series of meetings, to define or redefine impact, and to create the right level of conversation about what's actually working in their portfolio. And for lots of reasons, from just human dynamics to the culture of nice that we have in nonprofits, to kind of confusion about whether something has to be formally evaluated before we can say it's not working. You know, there's lots of different reasons that it's difficult for teams of people to sit down and take stock. And so that's one of the advantages of this process. And in the new book, we lay that out more deeply and provide sort of process guidelines and agendas about how to have the conversation about what's working. If we aren't having that conversation regularly, of course, we're not doing optimal stewardship. It's everybody's intent to be doing excellent programming, but how often are we really talking about that together honestly? So that's one of the takeaways. And so therefore, we really advanced that thinking the second time around to lift that up. A second thing is that there's still so much misinformation and hoopla and finger pointing around revenue strategy. And as Steve just showed, we put the fund development programs right in this model. They are held in the same way. They are evaluated for both impact and profitability. And for many groups that we work with, that's the first time they've ever sat down and said, how good is this fund development program? How good are we at executing it? How profitable is it, in fact? What's the opportunity cost of holding on to a legacy special event to please our board when it actually doesn't net and it takes all year to plan? So really sitting down and saying, what should we be doing from a revenue standpoint? Again, it's not, that conversation is not usually had that way. And this process creates a space to say, let's look at this set of revenue streams and how effective they are, or not. And in particular, I think with so much misinformation about the value of diversification, people think they should be in more streams. And Steve and I actually believe that people should probably be in fewer streams and committing to building the systems, culture, and competency to win in those streams. And I don't think we're the only ones that think that. So really sitting down and saying, what are our 1, 2, maybe 3 primary streams? How do they tie to our impact? And how do we commit to really being effective in those streams rather than trying to add more streams that we can be mediocre at? And then a big thing about the matrix map process, as you saw, is that bottom left quadrant. You know, what are we to do with programs that, by our assessment through this process, land in that bottom left quadrant, which is that they are relatively unimportant any longer from a mission impact, intended impact standpoint, and they lose money. And you know, over the course of an organization's life cycle, there are going to be things that fall into that category that it's time to move away from. And part of what this process does, again, is create the space to come to that conclusion together. Doesn't mean it's easy, but part of what we're trying to help people pivot from is this idea that their job as staff and board is to preserve and add things when they keep forgetting that another part, and part of our definition that Steve showed, is to have the agility and the discipline to stop doing things that are no longer necessary relatively compared to the other things that we could be doing, and to flip that idea that it's a loss or a resignation to actually a stewardship role. And a powerful one, to create more attention and energy and mind share in the organization to be doing the things that it should be doing today. So that's a big advantage of this process, is creating the space for people to come to that conclusion together and then make really good plans for the graceful exit. And then lastly, the original book was part of a growing number of books, La Piana's book, other books, lots of writing in the Stanford Social Innovation Review and the Nonprofit Quarterly, and everybody, and across sectors, by the way, just challenging notions of strategy and strategy formation and trying to reinvigorate the thinking about how organizations define and set strategy. And so we were in a large chorus of people trying to challenge leaders to think differently about that. And we all know the adage of this sort of habit, this addiction in our field to strategic planning. And again, there's nothing wrong with strategic planning as long as it's actually strategic. And what we still find, and this process helps us hopefully kind of educate the whole system and then get really clear on the definitions, is that when we list our programs, we've done just that. We've listed our programs. We haven't said a word about strategy yet. And we haven't even said a word about impact yet. So each of those three things have very different meanings. What impact are we trying to have? What strategies are we going to use across the whole system to achieve that? And then how do those strategies show up in our program design and program execution? But we still find that those three things get very, very conflated, and the vocabulary is confusing and the concepts are confusing. And so we hope that this process unpacks all of those and helps people get to sharp definition about what's a program, what's a strategy, what's an intended impact.
Thank you so much, Jeanne. Oh, sorry.
I want to just share this, if I can, Ruth, this recent blog of Barbara Kibbe's. You can just search for this 5-thing strategy isn't. One of the quotes she says is that this insularity of strategy formation is so dated. And so one of the things we write about in the first part of this book is we say, we understand, for those of us who are really compelled by putting our organizations in a much broader context of field or movement or social change process, well, my goodness, isn't this just navel-gazing to look back and keep matrix mapping our own program set? And that's not at all the intent of this. The intent of this is actually to get very clear on how the organization can be an instrument of change in a much broader context. But to be able to do that, you have to know what it is you're doing, why you're doing it, how it's working, so that you can go out and be an effective partner, a not duplicative partner, a not competitive partner, but really an aligned partner to other organizations and efforts. So we definitely intend this not to be a closed system kind of process, but a foundation from which an organization can then be in its broader context much more effectively.
That's actually really helpful. I have a million questions about what you just said, Jeanne, but I'm going to move. I'm actually going to just move along and ask Steve to talk a little bit about what's changed in the new book.
Yeah. So, as Jeanne and I kind of have been each in our Jeanne out in the Bay Area nationally, and me based in Milwaukee, and working with a lot of organizations in the Midwest, have been rolling out this tool. We really started thinking about how do we take these observations that we had and refine and evolve the tool to be even more helpful and more strategic for organizations. And I think that one of the pieces is that, as Jeanne said, this is a little bit of a new way of thinking. And so sometimes it's a new mental muscle that senior leaders and boards have to use in doing this tool. And so it takes a little bit of time and a little bit of practice to kind of get there. In the new book, one of the key things we did is building on that is we really have much more of an impact focus that really along with the sector, as there's been kind of these shifts from being oriented around a mission statement and what we believe in to much more so what is our impact? What's our intended impact that we want to have? And we borrowed some of this language from the great work that Bridgespan Group has done. And we start off our process right now with articulating intended impact. What is our current analysis of the problem? And really making sure that we get clarity among senior leadership and in some cases boards where around what is it that the organization wants to do, will accomplish, and to some degree, how will it measure that, both either anecdotally, but what does success look like? So how will we know when the problem is solved? What observable changes will we have? So here's an example from a domestic violence agency, is that survivors of DV will have access to justice and healing that is relevant, responsive, and reflects the realities of their experience. So then really thinking about, what does that do? And to use this impact statement as a beacon for the organization. Writing intended impact statements can be challenging for organizations, especially if they haven't necessarily thought in this more specific way. But it's worth the time, because these really, as I said, are beacons that can last an organization for 10 years or longer. That is really about how do you monitor your progress and impact for the organization. So we start there with knowing what it is you want to do. We add that in. And then we look at our programs and we assess the mission impact of our programs. And in this version, in the sustainability mindset, we've changed a little bit the criteria that we're using to assess mission impact. And we've made a couple of them required that we think all organizations should do it. I always feel a little odd saying the word required, because what's going to happen if you don't. But to get the best, most rigorous use of the tool, that you should use 2 criteria and then pick another 2 on your own. And so let's just take a look at where we are with the criteria today. We'll start with the first one, which is contribution to intended impact. So that's why we start the process now with articulating your intended impact. And then we want to know, how does every program that the organization carries out, mission specific and fund development, how does it contribute towards accomplishment of that? Recognizing, one of the basic tenets that both Jeanne and I believe is that everything an organization does may have value, but not everything has the same value. There are varying degrees of that value, varying degrees of the way an organization and its programs contribute towards the intended impact of the organization. So you might have a direct service program that is right on and very high on contribution, and you may have an outreach or an education awareness program which still has impact but is not quite as high in contributing to your intended impact as the direct service. So trying to parse that out and separate and get people to recognize that and realize that a little bit more is the purpose of this first criterion, contribution to intended impact. And you can see an example down there that we're looking at as the programs are currently executed. As we execute them today, how does it relate to the intended impact of the organization? The second criterion that we would say is required is excellence in execution. So this one we continue to believe is really important for organizations. And part of the reason is that something may be important for contributing to your intended impact, but it may not still be executed in a superior, excellent way. One of the challenges I think that we both believe with strategic planning is that the challenge that organizations face isn't always in planning, it's in implementation. That's when, when you throw theory out the window and start actually getting into it and implementing, that's when a lot of decisions and pieces need to be made. And so this criterion tries to get at that. Is this a core competency of the organization? Do we have the right people that are delivering it? Are we able to deliver this in a superior, excellent way? And trying to kind of, again, parse that out between our different programs and to also in the contribution with intended impact. So
Steve,
we still recommend, yes.
Steve, hi. I'm getting a couple of questions related to these 2 impact criteria, so I think it might be helpful for you and I to speak to them before we move on here. One is the distinction between a mission statement and an impact statement, and I think we can share a little bit about why we evolved in that direction. And in the first book, the criteria was called alignment with core mission. And so, Steve, do you want to address why we changed the language there and what you see as the distinction?
Yeah. So, as I use kind of the definition from Bridgespan around intended impact, which is a series of statements that about what the organization will specifically do and in some ways be held accountable for. So to me, mission statements are broad, they're inspirational and aspirational. And they're big marketing statements in times to bring in donors and kind of put out the big tent, whereas an impact statement is a little more narrowing and more focused about what it is the outcome of the organization's work will be. I often tell people that impact statements tend to be more internal instead of external, although I will be honest that usually after people I've worked with go through the process of putting one together, they share it externally. But really, really thinking about how will we do and using it as a way of kind of prioritizing and understanding what it is the organization seeks to accomplish.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would agree with that. I would add that I think in today's age, discerning donors are probably less interested in the big tent than they might have been, 15 or 20 years ago. So I would agree with you that if you can get that impact statement said in a way that, is accessible and clear to an external audience, that's probably the direction we're heading in terms of what most people want to hear that their resources or volunteer hours are contributing to. So because some people have asked, should you have one or both? And, obviously there's no one right answer. But for me personally, mission is losing stamina as an organizing principle, and definitely as the problem from the matrix map perspective with mission is that when we had that as a criteria, well, very few organizations are doing things that are literally contrary to their mission. So it's a throwaway idea. Missions, if you've gotten that far off, then sure, if you're doing something that undermines your mission. But most people aren't, and so it's actually it's not a rigorous enough question. So from a strategy perspective, it has not, I think it's lost some value as a strategy screen, which is what most people are looking for, is like a decision-making screen. And I think from a decision-making process, what we're really looking for when we have, comparing opportunity A to opportunity B, is which will drive impact more. They're probably both mission aligned, is how I would think of it. And then the other question that was coming up was like, how do you define excellence in this one here? And you see that in this particular example, they gave some language to that. It's going to look a little different, potentially in any organization. But on the other hand, how can we not define it, right? And this one is very experience-based. This is having a group of people inside the organization sit down and reckon with the fact that they have, rampant staff turnover in Program A. They never meet their numbers in Program A. They've been wondering whether Program A really needs to be here. It's time to sit down and look at the portfolio. And excellence, again, mission alignment. Program A is probably mission aligned. What people are really wondering is, why do we keep doing this thing that we're not very good at? So this brings in the experience. The matrix map is by design a subjective process. You certainly draw on objective data, but it's often the first time the group of people have sat around the table and said, look, what do we know? What do we know? Program B, we seem to knock it out of the park. Program A, we don't knock it out of the park. How do we make sense of that? Okay. Steve, you can
yeah, and I would just say I think that there is, and as part of this process, a lot of things that are that you're needing to define, that people do need to define what their intended impact is and really think about that. Those are really important discussions to have, because even within organizations that we've worked with, different managers and different board members have a different idea of the impact. And so it's hard to get everybody going in the same direction if you're trying to drive to a different place. So there's a question for me around what the through line is. And then I would say the same thing with excellence, that having that discussion of what is excellence is really important. One of my pet peeves, honestly, is when people say, we will deliver a quality program. Well, what does that mean? How, let's move beyond kind of that word and really define, how are you defining what quality is, and how am I? And having that kind of robust, rigorous discussion can really help advance an organization's thinking, and I would say program delivery and impact. So if we use those two criteria, and we see the contribution to intended impact and the excellence in execution, and then we say that use organizations in assessing impact, and again, you're going to do this with every program you have. You're going to assess them on a total of 4 criteria. So choose 2 more criteria and tailor them to come up with a total of 4. And the criteria that people choose, we still say really depends upon what it is the strategic issue that you are facing as an organization. Which one of these resonate and kind of talk to you based on that. So we have several that were here before. Scale and depth, which we looked at from we're in the last book as well, touching or influencing a lot of people, so that's scale. And there's a great article in the Nonprofit Quarterly about scale and nonprofits that you should look at if you haven't already in this one that just came out. As well as depth in criteria 4. So, how deep of an intervention is this program offering? The criterion 5 there, significant unmet need. So this one is different from in the first book. In the first book we called it filling an important gap, but it gets a little bit at the same thing, and that is kind of the market landscape in which the program is operating in. So we ask with significant unmet need 2 questions, really. The first one being, is there a lot of competition or similar program offerings to this particular program? And then if the answer is yes, there's a second question that says, is there still more demand for service than there is supply? So, for example, a city may have a lot of homeless shelters, and yet at the end of the day, they may still have more homeless than there are beds for. So it's trying to look at both of those components to say, is there significant unmet need for this program? Criterion 6 there is community building. Does this particular program build community or connect people around the program, the organization, or the cause? And then criteria 7, which is leverage, which is, does this particular program build relationships or partnerships both internally within the organization or externally to expand your reach? How do you leverage this program to go beyond just its own individual impact? So again, there's 7 criteria in there. What we recommend is that people use the first 2, and then from the remaining 5, choose 2 more that relate to your organization's strategic issue that kind of resonate with you, and to put those all together. After you've done that, the process then of putting together the map is still, is fairly straightforward, and is similar to what it was in the last book. But we pause after we put the map together. In the last book, we offered some strategic imperatives that went right to the programmatic level. And what we've learned is, and we knew this a little bit last time, but we underestimated, I think, how really transformative the map can be and how it can help people see the organization as a holistic system for the first time. So many of us come into nonprofits, both board members and sometimes senior staff, from one particular aspect or program of the organization. So when you see the matrix map for the first time, it can be the first time that you're actually seeing the whole picture. And rather than going straight to the programs, let's pause and take a look at what it is the big picture is telling us. What's the overall narrative here? And understanding how the programs are clustered. We offer several archetypes of how programs are usually clustered for organizations, what that means, and understanding in a holistic manner kind of how it is that the programs are interacting to create impact and financial viability. And we ask that then people after doing that and discussing it, come up with a couple messages. What's the narrative of the map? And there's an example that you can see there on your screen. And then after you kind of had that big picture, then you can go into the programmatic level implications and understand based on, again, based on where the program falls in the map and which quadrant, to understand what the implications are that you might want to consider. And I will say that in this book, we offer many more questions that should be asked of programs or asked about programs depending upon where they're placed in the map, of really understanding kind of its role and perhaps exploring ideas, but also trying to understand the implications of strategies on both elements of sustainability, both the financial component as well as the impact component.
Great. I'm going to step in here and then we'll and do one more concept, and then Ruth, you can open it up with some ideas. Another new piece in the book to kind of come back full circle to what I said earlier about the challenge of getting really clear on revenue strategy, and this matrix map process as a nice means for getting the whole system to be asking into the strength of its current revenue model. We framed it this time as right revenue, and this sense of being in proper relationship to the revenue, going back to our definition of sustainability, where that program strength and that financial strength are really working together. And so we posited at least these 5 questions. Sort of again, you're looking at the map as a whole and the experience of looking at the relationship between money and impact in your model. And so a lot of times we have a lot of groups who feel like they don't have as strong a revenue model as they need. And what are some ways they can ask into that? Obviously, overall, does the current revenue mix reliably produce a modest surplus? So this whole thing is about, at the community-based level, assuming that the system has to be exceptionally impactful and modestly profitable. And again, that profit can come from donations or earned income or all of the above, but it's got to be, the whole system can't lose money. So does this current mix, as we're executing it, produce that modest surplus on a consistent basis? Is some portion of it reliably unrestricted? Do we have some flexibility in our working capital? And then we get into some, I think, kind of deeper questions that often organizations face as they really stop and look at this. And one of the things we're seeing a lot is people grappling with the fact that their largest sources of income may or may not be paying for work that they deem essential to our intended impact. And here again, the difference between intended impact and mission. Most people are not getting money that's not on mission, but many people are getting money that isn't allowing them to innovate or evolve their theory of change around program design, community engagement, and other things. This is particularly true with government funding, where the people inside the organization are starting to realize that methodologically they've moved way past their primary funding streams, and now they're really caught, because if they commit to impact, not programs, they are out of sync with their core revenue streams. Are we relying on a funding stream that is changing substantially, and is that change beyond our control? So how do we think about the Affordable Care Act, or what's going on in community development block grants, or the aging out of the performing arts audience base? All of these different things that are going on in different fields financially, how does the organization relate to that sort of macro issue that's going on in its stream, and is it something they can influence, or do they in fact need to be thinking about a stream sunsetting and what will replace it, or how will they work differently with that stream? And then also, are we relying on a funding stream that's misaligned with our organizational values? The experience that we've had is that when we get really focused on impact and less on preserving programs, it brings us full circle back to organizational values. When we say, what's our analysis of the problem? Remember that sentence? That's one of the questions we were asked to get to intended impact. Well, when you talk about what your analysis of the problem is, you're starting to get into a values-based conversation. And that means that you may, in fact, realize that some of your money does not have the same analysis of the problem, and therefore they're not going to be aligned around the same notion of impact. Now, I'm not saying that everybody's going to be perfectly aligned, but organizations may find themselves wanting to reevaluate what really would be the best way to resource this work, given how our analysis of the problem and how we want to work on it. So there's a whole section in the book about facilitating that conversation and thinking about intentionally about how do we get the revenue to really be in that flywheel effect with our notion of impact and our program set. So Ruth, I'm going to turn it back over to you after that and see if there are things you'd like to pick up on from what we said or elsewhere in the book.
And I don't want to use up all the time, so if there are other questions from those who are listening, you can break in at any moment. Sure. I want to ask a question about what kinds of organizations, are there any particular sizes of organization for whom this works better? Are there any kind of criteria going in when you want to use this process with an organization, is there any particular things that you look for in that organization as being indicators that it's likely to be a useful process for them?
Mm-hmm. I would say for me that size is not terribly important. There's a certain level of capacity that an organization has to ask these two questions of itself at once. So for instance, if the organization has really, really, really bad financial data, has not built its systems at all around program level income and expense, obviously the horizontal axis will be very difficult. I mean, we can work on it, but then it becomes more of a capacity building engagement, right? So if there's really bad or no information about financial performance at the program level, the map itself, will be difficult. But other than that, it's not so much about size. My answer would be readiness. The only time that I've had this really, really, really bomb was a system where the executive director had not built trust in the team, and she was trying to use it to get to a certain result. And so she was trying to game the process to set up a set of unpopular decisions. So like any kind of a tool or consulting engagement, that obviously won't work. So there has to be at least a moderate level of trust to have these conversations.
And I guess another question that I would have is, what if an organization is really not clear about the cost of its various activities? So if it's not clear about its own net versus gross on fundraising, or if it's not clear about the cost of a program, how do you work with that with organizations?
Well, I think that I'm a big fan of organizations understanding, of course, what the cost of program delivery is. And I think that, each of the components of the matrix map in itself, as Jeanne mentioned, could be a capacity building exercise, understanding your impact and the intended impact and articulating that, as well as the financial piece and understanding your cost of services. What I often tell people is that, look, this is, these are not audited numbers. It's supposed to be an accurate reflection, though, about what the true profitability is for each of these programs. And so it is an opportunity to kind of build and develop that financial literacy and financial understanding within, within an organization. And so we do have, there's templates actually that are, that accompany the new book that are at nonprofitsustainability.org, and there is one where people can take their current budget and list the programs out, and then sit there and think about where are our staff spending their time, how can we, where are the expenses going, and where's the revenue coming from, to be able to begin to calculate some of that. What is that true cost? Because I think that's a pretty important concept to understand if you're going to be sustainable. And so spending time perhaps doing that first and working on that capacity and then moving to the map, I've seen organizations have a fair amount of success.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I'm going to ask an absolutely practical question. I would actually love some examples about the variety of ways you've done this, but what does the process look like? How long does it take? Is it one session? Is it multiple sessions? And who's included in these kinds of conversations?
Great, and actually we spent a lot more time describing that in this book because, again, we didn't really know when we wrote the first book. We had a basic concept, but now we have a lot of different examples, and there isn't one answer to that question, but what we have really agreed to is that has to be thought out in advance and articulated to the whole organization, because the problem with this is that if you kind of dabble in this and then make some decisions and then go back to your system and say, we did a matrix map and here's what it told us, and therefore we're doing X, not surprisingly, it doesn't go very well. So even if it's not going to be the whole staff and board that are involved in this, and it typically is not unless it's a really small organization, we actually walk you through a process of really thinking through who's going to be involved, who's going to do the assessment. That impact assessment is a huge deal, right? Who gets to participate in choosing those 4 criteria and then actually assessing each program. I think probably in a good chunk of the work that Steve and I do, that's done by, there's a task force that is managing the whole process. But oftentimes, many more people than that task force are involved in the impact scoring, for instance. They might, if it's a large organization, they might do that impact scoring via an online survey, or they might do it via a staff retreat or a staff and board retreat. So there's usually some combination of a smaller task force that's kind of designing and stewarding the whole process, but then times of really engaging as many people as possible, because the objective here is that you come out the other side of this not just with a map, but with a system that's permanently more savvy about what it's trying to do and how it's paying for that. So from our perspective, you want to err on the side of inclusion, at least at key moments, both for the educational purposes, but also so that there's buy-in to whatever decisions or kind of mindset shifts it might elicit. In terms of how long it takes, if you do it, if you move all the way through the process and really take each, it's probably a couple of months if you really were to see it as, just because of how long it takes to meet and digest information and such. But at the same time, you could use the dual bottom line framework in a one-day retreat, if you like. And I know that Steve and I have both done that.
Yep.
But the book writes it as if you were going to, from start to finish, kind of self-administer this internally. It would probably take you, 8 weeks or so just to move through all the steps. What would you say, Steve?
Yeah, I mean, there's certain parts of it that can accordion depending upon how much time you have. But you don't want to rush through it in a way that then it just becomes another checklist of things that you need to do, and it doesn't have meaning. So a lot of these conversations, as we've outlined today, can really be in depth, and I think taking the time to have those discussions will really benefit organizations. I would agree. I think 6 to 8 weeks is probably where I see it fall a lot. There are some that I've done it with organizations that knew the concept and knew the theory of it within in an afternoon. But I think that the key factor there for me is kind of leadership and understanding and being able to really hold that candid conversation and the rigor of the process.
And Ruth, just to be clear, for us, in quote unquote, a full-blown strategic planning process, this is typically phase one. So historically in planning, phase one was revisiting mission, vision, values, for instance. At least for Compass Point, I think this is true at Spectrum as well as Steve's firm. We want to start with what plane are we flying and how is it flying before we start purporting to set strategy or shift strategy. And I would rather start with, let's refresh our statement of intended impact and then look at how the plane we're flying right now is flying, and then we can have a conversation about, do we need to make shifts in strategy?
Yeah, and this is about, you need to understand your organization. Again, from the intended impact to how it is the programs are working together today in order to then be able to say, okay, where do we want to go into the future?
Now, can you talk a little bit about, and you kind of referred to this before, but when an organization is in conflict, when it has opposing points of view about whether or not a program is being delivered well, whether or not a program is impact important, how do you manage that conversation?
Very gingerly.
Oh.
I mean, well, that's where it takes a little more time. And if this process is happening in that moment in time where there are meaningful questions, meaningful forks in the road around how we're defining our purpose, as Steve just alluded to, if I was consulting that situation, as soon as that was emerging, I would literally name that and set schedule or set up, 2 or 3 ways of coming at that, and making sure the right people are involved in that. So, because why miss this opportunity, right? So you don't want to just, and this is what happens in strategic planning too, actually, is that those kind of conflicts come up and we're 6 months in and someone just has to force it through and get the darn thing written, right? Right. I think we want to avoid that, and if that's as Steve and I always say, the map is just the map. I mean, it's a nice visual representation of the model and the work, but that's not the point. The point is the conversations that lead up to the map and then the analysis of the map. And so if we're in conflict about our intended, what our theory of change is or what excellence means, from my perspective, we should stop and tee that up as a series of conversations. I'll say that I think this is, Steve and I go back and forth on this. This is a little bit more, from my perspective, a staff-driven process. Again, in traditional planning, we think of the board as the kind of the client and the ED and the board. I see in this work, these are conversations that you kind of have to work there to have. At it with a depth and a candor, and so sometimes we have board members on the task force, but they're not driving this process to me. What they become is a critical, recipient of this, and how do we make meaning of this? Here's the narrative. Here's what we're learning. What does that mean for our strategic direction, et cetera? But to get really good data and to have the hard conversations that need to happen inside a system, that is disproportionately a staff conversation to me.
And I would also just say, Ruth, that I think that these conversations are happening. I mean, I've been I've worked at too many nonprofits where we might not talk in the conference room about the impact and excellence, but we sure talk about them over a beer after work. So what we're trying to do is to bring that conversation into the system and into the rigor and into the conference room, so that these can be addressed in a constructive way, be able to improve the organization.
Is there I have so many more questions to ask you. I'm sorry, we're almost out of time. But is there an aha moment, a typical aha moment in this process when people sit back and look at the matrix? And what does that look like and feel like?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for the aha moments with the clients I've worked with comes at two different times. I think, for those that are trying to increase their sustainability, too often the idea of how to do that is let's add a revenue stream without ever fully first thinking about, how would that impact our organization? How would we fund that? How would we invest that? What's working today that we could perhaps build upon? So when in trying to, explaining that concept and understanding their organization where it is first and having some data around it, that creates an aha moment. And then I think that in seeing that map for the first time, especially at times in larger organizations, people can then begin to see that direct connection between some of the different programs that they might have known or thought about, but never really as visibly clear. So that there's suddenly a sequencing that if you want to grow one program, you need to be exceptional at something else first. And oftentimes that happens with those programs that are structured that they can't break even. There is, they're high impact programs, but there isn't a revenue strategy for them. And that's why we talk about fund development programs and the culture of philanthropy. And that's why that's important for organizations. And being able to visualize it in that way, in that interaction, or that relationship rather, between the two programs, I think causes that a big aha. And it can be pretty powerful.
Mm-hmm. I would just say briefly that people, I think, realize that they have not been holding the two together, and that we as nonprofits are structurally set up to hold them separately. There's a finance committee, there's a program committee, and that you sort of have this process realization, my God, we've been in our own way. We're structured in our own, we're literally in our own way about this. The way we report, the darn, all the rating sites and the 990 and our overhead rates and all this garbage, right? And we have not been having the conversation is how does the program and money work together in one holistic way? And how do we restructure our time, our conversations, our reporting to keep telling that story so that we can really hone that and make it work well together?
I think this is probably close to a good place to stop, but I just want to ask one other little question. This is really about trying to create an overall enterprise model where the programs, your strategy for programs is tightly aligned with your strategy for revenue, and where that you can see forward with that revenue, and you know that you can handle the transaction costs with it. Is there anything else that is important that you feel like you haven't yet said that you want to end out besides buy this book? And I actually will say that, buy this book. I've used this process a number of times myself, and it's like a little miracle. But is there anything that you want to end with, either one?
I have one sentence that we haven't talked about that's another aha, which is that it's human beings inside each of those bubbles. It's their performance, their alignment or non-alignment that is a huge part of why that bubble lands where it does. And so one of the ahas that people have is that not only have we conceptually held these two things apart, but we have not had that conversation, the two things being impact and money. We have not really prepared enough people inside our organization to engage in that conversation with us. And so it brings up a lot of questions about talent and readiness and how we're going to get our people, not just our board or our ED, but our people aligned around this.
And I'll just pick up on that and say, for me, I always go back to the fact that, as I said, sustainability is an orientation, not a destination. And there is no silver bullet out there that is going to make your organization sustainable, but rather it is about engaging the best minds that you have available to yourself, to your organization around the table for this discussion. And that the matrix map, from my perspective, is an engagement tool to be able to have those discussions and ultimately to make strategic decisions to move your organization forward and then learn and adjust and continue that process going forward.
Thank you very much. And Steve and Jeanne, I just want to thank you on behalf of all the people who are listening for all your wisdom. I do want to recommend that people do buy the map, buy the book, use the map, because it's an experience and one well worth having. And hopefully we will meet again soon. I would love to have Steve and Jeanne back at some point to talk a little bit more about some of the other aspects of this. So if you're interested in that, make sure you keep an eye out and you can sign up. Thank you very much for coming, and we wish you well. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.